one of the things that I had to realize in making my decision between the two churches was just that with the schism, like both sides lost something. There are scars on both sides.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian podcast. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Katrina Estok. And for everyone watching or listening, Katrina, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you spend your time doing?
Yeah, so I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I live primarily in Calgary, Canada, and the primary thing that I do is teach piano, and I also do a little bit of editing and literacy tutoring as well. So.
Okay, wonderful. That's a nice, concise summary. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing, your religious upbringing, what that looked like, and maybe talk about it in terms of what that looked like in the home versus if there was like a communal gathering of some sort, what that looked like as well.
Yeah. So I was raised actually very loosely Catholic. Both sides of my family, I'm Catholic ethnically, you could say. On my mom's side, Italian. On my dad's side, Hungarian. And so, though it was my mom's side where that influence primarily came in. And so, we were very loosely Catholic, I would say. Not even you hear about the Christmas Easter Catholic. It was just the Christmas we'd go to the mass. But I did actually receive all my sacraments in the Catholic Church. So I was baptized in the Catholic Church, and I also went to Catholic school. So I had that influence. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Catholic school in at least in Alberta, it's maybe secular with kind of a dose of Catholicism. A lot of the teachers themselves aren't necessarily practicing Catholics or Christians. And so I did have that influence growing up, but it wasn't very strong. But I always had a sense of liking the Mass and the sacraments, even though I didn't really understand what it meant.
Okay. And was there any semblance of faith that came through in the home setting? Like, did you guys occasionally pray together, or did you have some religious art in the home, or was there anything that would give it away as a Catholic home?
No, that's a good question. Not really. I mean, we would go to church, at Christmas time. And I remember when I was a kid, if I was sad, my mom would always say, "Oh, God loves you, Katrina," and she would comfort me with that. But we didn't really pray together. My dad has never been particularly religious. He's not anti-religious, and now he's kind of gotten into it a bit more. But as a child, he would always emphasize, Katrina, you need to question everything. My mom did too, to an extent, but my dad was, question everything. Don't just believe what people tell you. And so this really played a part in how I approached religion and the things that I couldn't maybe prove. And so I would say I wanted to believe and I wanted to understand, but I didn't have that influence. And I didn't have any sort of framework for understanding. In addition, there was a bit in my extended family, there was a bit of a New Age influence. And so this actually was quite significant for me. And so I had those elements coming in and confusing me, and they actually continued to play a part in my I guess my faith journey, or my questions of faith, for a long time into my early adult years as well.
Okay, so it sounds like you were open to Christianity to a certain degree, but didn't have a strong formation in it, at least originally. And then there was this influence of some New Age beliefs in the wider family circle. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, New Age is pretty broad and there's different expressions of it. So what did it look like in your extended family?
There was just this kind of assumption in my family, on my mom's side. There was this kind of assumption in reincarnation, that this was just a reality. And so I was just, and I think, and a part of that too was, it was very, when I was growing up, that was something that was also part of popular culture was this curiosity towards that. And I remember, occasionally we'd watch Oprah, and she'd have these people come on who would talk about these past life regressions. And of course, I didn't really have a conception for demons, or this is where my really rational part came in, and I was like, what, demons? No, that's ridiculous. There are no demons, right? And so I was like, oh yeah, this person had a past life regression. I mean, I want to believe in this Christianity thing, but I mean, this is pretty convincing. And obviously sometimes that stuff it seems just so obviously a sham, but then sometimes there are these things that people know, or these kinds of the coincidences that just don't seem that they could be coincidences. And so I think I picked up on some of that. We also had this, there was a sense of angels, and there was some Native American spirituality that was explored in my family as well. And it was interesting, because I think looking back now on my childhood, those moments of tension when I was a child was actually corresponded most with when some of these practices were going on by family members or extended family members.
Okay. And so did you ever explore that path more thoroughly, or what happened from the time that you were, say, raised and it was more nominal to eventually exploring or finding about the Orthodox Church?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a big span of time. In terms of, so I guess something that I should mention in terms of the New Age stuff that was kind of interesting is that even though there were kind of these beliefs floating around, my mom was always very, very opposed to Ouija boards. And so it was just this thing. I remember when I was a kid, it was like, kind of open to some of these spiritual ideas, but then there was a limit. And I remember my mom told me multiple times throughout when I was a kid, like, if anyone ever has a Ouija board, don't go near it. Don't engage in that stuff. And I think she wouldn't have used the words demons, but she would have said, like, those are not good spirits. It's not good. Don't go near those kinds of things. So it's interesting, because I had a lot of people who are in the New Age movement, they kind of just take it all, but there was this distinction for me. And it wasn't something that was actively practiced, but it was just something that I assumed, oh, okay, yeah, this must be, in my mind, I was like, oh yeah, I guess reincarnation makes sense. And so that kind of had to work itself out later. But yeah, so when I was a kid, I always liked the Catholic Church for the sacraments. There was, even though we went to more of the new Catholic churches, the not the Latin Mass, right? There was still a sense of order and reverence that and liturgy that I always appreciated about that. And even though we went once a year with my family, when I was in school, that was something that we would go to masses every few months, really, because there was always something going on. And so I had this love for a tradition, or for the Mass, but I didn't really know what that was. And then I didn't really have anyone in my family nurturing that or explaining that to me in any sort of institutional sense. And then, so fast forward a little bit to when I was a teenager. When I was 15 years old, one of my best friends who we live across the alley from each other. We lived across the alley. She's kind of funny. She moved back into her parents' house. Her and her husband are renting it out now. And so she still lives across the alley from my parents, which, anyway, it's kind of a cool side note. But at the time, she was going to a Pentecostal church. And she was involved in the youth group. And so she invited me to one of the Pentecostal church youth events when we were 15, and I was kind of like, okay, yeah, this was I had just started grade 10. That's high school for people who are in Alberta. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, okay, that sounds like fun. It's interesting. And so I went to this church, and it was a Pentecostal church. And It was very, very different from the Catholic setting in which I was raised. I ended up going to this church actually for about 3 years, and I became quite involved in the youth group. I mean, they did a lot of really fun things, and I made friends there. We went on a couple missions trips. Actually, I went on a couple missions trips with the church. The first one was to London, and then the second one was to Germany and Russia. Actually, we spent quite a few weeks in Russia, which was interesting. And this was around the time I was 18, 19. And yeah, but anyway, so there was this Pentecostal church setting, but they would put these theological ideas out there, or they would talk about what it meant to be a Christian. And I never agreed with their conception of theology. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And one thing that always bothered me too was that how just kind of flippantly people would talk about, oh, this person is going to hell, or this person is going to hell, or, I'm saved because of this. And I just thought that was intuitively, that was just so sacrilegious. And it's not that I necessarily was of the mindset that, oh, everyone needs to be saved, but it just seems so kind of vulgar to be speaking about the eternal salvation of these other people's souls. And I thought to myself, like, if you truly believe this, don't you think that maybe you would spend more time praying for these people instead of kind of self-righteously gossiping about them? And so anyway, that was my sense. And again, their ideas about God, about tradition, it just seemed very black and white. And it didn't, and again, this was kind of this side of my upbringing with my dad of questioning everything. And so I was really, really critical of the ideas that were touted in this church. And so it wasn't enough for me to let go of some of my other New Agey beliefs. So I was going to this church for 3 years, and I would have called myself a Christian. And I had several experiences or encounters with Christ during that time. But I still held on. Oh yeah, reincarnation could still be a thing. And I remember when I was on the mission trip to Russia, I had this weird belief that I just kind of made up. That I thought, oh, once we die, we all become angels, and then we get to become someone's guardian angel. And I remember I was telling someone on the trip about this. Oh yeah, this is the reality when we die. And he just looked at me and he was like, Katrina, that's not biblical at all. That's not Christian at all. And I was like, what do you mean it's not Christian? Whatever, it makes sense. So yeah, that was that phase of life.
Okay, that's a helpful summary of it. So if I can summarize, just to make sure I'm grasping it correctly. So it sounds like you were raised in a pretty nominal setting in terms of the Christian content. There was this wider influence of New Age within your family. So then it's all kind of mixed up, and it's, to use a technical term, it's kind of syncretistic. It's like you've got these different influences that don't naturally align, that are getting mixed up in the pot, as it were. And then you have this neighbor that moves in, or you start talking with her, and this is around when you're 15, and you start going to the Pentecostal church for a period of 3 years. And it sounds like you're pretty involved, like you're going on these mission trips, but also just regularly attending church there, from what I gather. But it's not something that sat with you 100%, like in terms of the actual doctrines or the theology that was being expressed, as well as some of the cultural things in terms of like saying people are going to heaven or hell, you weren't on board with. So if that's accurate, what happened next?
Yeah, that's accurate. So, yeah, and I guess just a few things to add to that too is I felt quite disillusioned after the trip to Russia, because the trip to England was actually great. It was a really positive experience. We had a really great group, and I didn't feel like we were proselytizing. I felt like we were just kind of interacting with this community and seeing how they were doing their ministry, and it wasn't like we were inserting ourselves. But when we went to Russia, it was very different, and we were kind of taking more of an active preaching role. We were working in a kids camp, and we were talking about depth of community and virtue and everything. And I just remember thinking, this is so hypocritical, because within our own team we didn't have any sort of cohesion or a sense of community, and it was just it seemed, or humility, and it just seemed very strange to me that we were preaching to these people. And then also I was so confused. We were in Russia, and I was looking, and I remember there was this wedding that came out of, from obviously an Orthodox church, and I was like, aren't they, wait a minute, isn't Russia already Christian? And they're, oh yeah, no, don't worry about that, that's not really, this is really Christian. And I was just like, okay, like this is strange. But yeah, so that was that. And then I also kind of had an issue. I never felt like I fit into the worship setting. As you know, it's very, in a lot of evangelical settings, it's very emotional, and the music is quite loud. It's quite poppy, and I never really took to that. I always felt like I was being a bit manipulated and made to feel a certain way, and I got, you know, this high on a Sunday morning, and then obviously it would fade over the week. And it was this emotional high was assumed to be the Holy Spirit, and so it was just kind of strange to me. And then so I was going to that church until I went to my undergrad degree, and in my undergraduate years I went to a Christian university, as you know, and but it wasn't a Pentecostal. It was more. It had more of, I guess, a traditional grounding, but it was still evangelical alliance. And yeah, and so I stopped going to this Pentecostal church because what happened was there was this huge affair that erupted between the lead pastor, whom everyone, including myself, looked up to. I looked up to him very, very much, and it turned out that he was having an affair with someone else when he was married with 3 children, and so it just, that kind of, that, you know, he was one of the main reasons I think myself and many other people were attending the church. We appreciated his preaching, and then when that happened, I just kind of said, you know, forget about it. I'm not attached to the theology at this church, and this scandal is, quite frankly, a betrayal of many people. First and foremost, his wife has happened, and so I left that church. And then that's obviously that this is the same time I started going to this Christian university, and so I was still, even though I was studying music, I ended up doing a Bachelor of Music degree, and then also an English literature degree. And so at this Christian university, I was still getting an influence of faith. And in my second year, I started going to church again. I was living in residence, so it was still that evangelical influence. And we went to another, they would call themselves a non-denominational church, but it was more or less a Pentecostal church. And I went there initially because a lot of my friends on my floor went there. And again, it was the same kind of thing, very emotion driven. But actually at this time, so at the beginning of my second year, I started looking a little bit more into my Catholic roots. And I had a good friend from high school who was part of the Opus Dei. Do you know about the Opus Dei in the Catholic Church?
I'm not very familiar, but tell us about it.
Well, it's basically an order within the Catholic Church. It's more traditional. A lot of people who belong to Opus Dei, there'll be young people who won't be becoming nuns necessarily, but they'll pledge themselves to celibacy. And so and there's a house, an Opus Dei house in the city that I was studying in, and so I was kind of influenced by that from a friend from high school who was very devout Catholic, and so she told me about this upcoming trip that they were doing to Spain and Italy to go and see a beatification of Denelvro, and he was one of the leaders in the movement. I'm trying to remember. It was back in 2014, so it was a while ago now, almost 10 years. But yeah, so they were going to Spain and Italy, and she invited me to go on this trip, and I thought, you know, this would be a good opportunity for me to look into my Catholic roots. And again, like there were things about the Catholic Church that I always appreciated: the sacraments, Mary. Even if I didn't understand them, I still had a lot more reverence for that church than I ever did for this kind of more evangelical Protestant church. So I wanted to get more connected with that. And so I went on this trip, and it was a really interesting experience. I didn't realize that I was going to be the only person who wasn't devoutly Catholic, and I was, and didn't come from a devoutly Catholic family, and I'm an only child too. So everyone on the trip, without exception, had at least six siblings. And so when I told them I'm an only child, it was like, what? They were so like, they could not fathom. But it was a really good experience. I was able to, well, overall, it was a good experience. I would say I was surrounded by these devout Catholics. I was able to ask some questions about the sacraments, about Mary. This was around the time too, actually, I started praying the rosary. So that's one thing that I actually got from this trip, is I started praying the rosary, and it actually was something that sustained me through many difficult experiences in the year to come. And yeah, so I went on this trip, and we also saw the Pope in Rome, which was kind of cool at the time. And so I was able to ask these questions. I should also mention that part of my struggle was I was also quite strongly influenced by social liberalism growing up, especially in North America. And so I was kind of like, well, why can't gay people be married within the church? Why can't I had all these types of questions. And this is before that movement really devolved, for lack of a better word. And so it was kind of something that was a bit more reasonable. And so I thought, oh, why can't I had those questions, and I had this Catholic group that were giving me actually very solid answers for the more traditional viewpoint. And then I also had a very good friend in my undergrad who's still a very close friend of mine, and she's a devout Catholic too. So she, bless her, she had to endure liberal Katrina and all my questions, and she was homeschooled, and all my arrogance of like, oh, you're just homeschooled, you don't know what you're talking about. So that's a bit of that experience.
Okay. And so it's kind of remarkable in a way that you weren't going to Catholic mass that often when you were young. It sounds like it was once a year, but nevertheless, it made quite an impression. So that's pretty significant. And then it sounds also like the turning point, or where you would maybe consider yourself a Christian, was when you started going to this Pentecostal church, but you weren't necessarily strongly associated or committed to the denomination itself. Was that fair, that at that point you would consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So I would have considered myself a Christian, but in terms of being even just a lowercase o Orthodox Christian, I was not that. I still kind of held on to my reincarnation beliefs. I still was. I didn't have certain moral questions. I didn't have a strong stance on those, and so I would have called myself a Christian. I think probably many of these experiences that I had with Christ were sincere at that time, but I don't necessarily. I would have called myself a Christian, but yeah,
Okay.
there was definitely a discrepancy.
Okay. So you're getting closer to God throughout this period. It's like that's the trajectory that you're on, and you're taking steps. And so then you go to the Catholic Church, and you're wanting to explore your Catholic roots because there's something that you found attractive there, and you also had these sort of social liberal ethics at the time, or you said social ethics or social liberalism, something along those lines. But in terms of some of the common issues of our day, and so you wound up in the Orthodox Church, which isn't the Catholic Church. So how did that occur?
Yeah. So okay, well, so there's kind of more to the story as well, and it's honestly, I sometimes think back to this was in my early 20s. I was chrismated just over 6 years ago now. So when I think I was 22. Yeah, I was 22 when I was chrismated. And so my early 20s, in terms of faith experience, it was very chaotic. It was very back and forth. So even trying to organize where I was, it's kind of difficult because there were so many different things. And I would go to the Catholic Church, and then I would go and I would say, oh no, I'm going to explore this. And then so what happened? I would say actually when I became even just a lowercase o Orthodox Christian, where um, I stopped holding on to especially these more new age beliefs, was actually, it was my second semester of my undergrad. And so this was after I had come back from this trip to Spain and Italy. And within our undergrad, we had to take three Christian faith classes. So one was on the Bible, intro to the Bible, one was Christian faith, and then another one was an option. And so I was taking the Christian faith class, and I just happened to get this really great professor who, although he was not Orthodox himself, he had a very deep appreciation for early church history, for the church fathers, and for teaching about these early heresies, these early church councils. And so and I'm so grateful for that class, because I think depending on the professor, some people, there were certain professors who were like, oh, make up your own Apostles' Creed and then we can go through that. No. He was great. He went through the Apostles' Creed and he went line by line and just explained what this means, what it means to profess this creed. And then he also went over ancient heresies and a little bit over the ancient church councils. And this was the first time that Christianity was explained to me in a way that made sense. And it made sense in such a way that I was able to just say, okay, no, I let go. I saw that there was this inconsistency between reincarnation and Christianity, and then also just some of my other beliefs. And I said, oh, okay, this makes a lot of sense, and it is cohesive, and it is rational. And this is when I was able to really, I'd say, call myself a Christian, and call myself a Christian in more of a sincere way. And so there was that experience. But then I was so confused as to, okay, well, now that I'm sold on Christianity, like what on earth, where do I go for church? Where is the best church? And within my undergrad sphere and the evangelical sphere, there's this real push towards this notion that, oh, all these denominations, we're all one body, and the Lutherans are the hands, and the Catholics are they might not say the Catholics are the feet, the Nazarene are the feet, and like the non-denominational are the nose. And it's just this very sentimental view of like, oh, we're all one, but we're different parts of the body. And so I kind of had this notion for a while, and I would tell my Catholic friend this. And again, bless her, she was so patient with me. And she was just like, Katrina, that makes no sense. Like, what are you talking about? If your nose and your hand and your feet are in complete disagreement with each other, you're not cohesive. You're not a body. You're dysfunctional. You have some sort of disease. And so I also had this voice of reason that was through my friend. But I didn't even think about the question of, okay, well, it took me a while to think about the question of, historically speaking, which church makes the most sense. And so that came a bit later. But after this course, I went through what I call my ecclesiastical wayward phase. And so I was sold on Christianity, but I had no idea where I wanted to go. And I still had some of these more liberal ethics, or at least questions about that were not satisfied, that I didn't find satisfying answers for. And so so I ended up going to multiple churches for the next year, really. I went to various evangelical churches. I went to Lutheran churches, Presbyterian churches, and the Lutheran Presbyterian churches, I mean, those ones pretty much immediately I was kind of like, no, this is not it, because I just felt like, okay, they have the sacraments, so they say, except they don't have confession. And excuse me, and then in addition, you go so many of these churches, the population is really dying out. And I was the youngest person there. I know my dad, actually, my dad, who I kind of dragged with me a few times. He was the youngest person there, my at the time, 60-year-old father. And so I that immediately was kind of just intuitively, I thought, if there is not new life in this church, then it's probably not something that I really want to explore further. And I thought again about going to different like evangelical churches again, but it was the same stuff, the same issues that I had encountered, the same what I felt like was a lack of depth in the theology, in the worship ultimately. And I went to a United Church for one weekend. This was still when I was in my slightly liberal phase, and it actually had the complete opposite effect. It completely knocked me out of that. And so I went to this church, and it was first of all, the pastor, the priest, was a lesbian mom, and Jesus's name was not mentioned anywhere in the sermon or in the service, but the sermon was her just reading a book for 20 minutes about how Sylvia has two mommies and that's great and everything. And I came away from that experience, and I was so scandalized by the fact that here was this church that was using Christianity. I just saw through it. It's using Christianity to propel their agenda and their political beliefs. And so that pushed me even farther away from the liberal movement. And then this was also at the time when that movement itself was just getting so fraught, we could say, for
well, it's like woke. That's a good umbrella term. I'm kind of curious, just to interject for a second, because I think that's kind of the water that a lot of people are swimming in right now, in terms of just these assumptions about how the world works that are influenced by like this woke ideology or more of a liberal stream of thought that's gone off the rails. So what were the questions that you were wrestling with at the time, maybe in just sort of like a brief fashion, and how did you find resolution to those within Christianity? Because I think a lot of people are in that same place.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I thought that, if two people love each other, why can't they be together? And I didn't really think about the distinction between legal same-sex marriage versus same-sex marriage in the church until a bit later. But I think I was so influenced by this like Brokeback Mountain culture of when I grew up, of like, they love each other and they're just so persecuted. And so I'm trying to think back on that time and remember I have some of the questions. I think I just intuitively, I was taken over by this spirit of what I felt like was compassion, of just like, well, why can't they? This is something in many cases they didn't choose, they can't control. And so I just thought, like, why, and why is the church not blessing this? And I don't know if I did. I don't know. I think I was really torn about that, because I could see both sides. And then as I got moving into some of the more traditional ethics of it, it just kind of, honestly, it kind of resolved itself on an intuitive level for me, of like, oh, okay, this is why, and this is why this is not permitted in the church. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I think if I was summarizing that, it sounds like you had these ideas and questions, and throughout the growing up period, there was a lot of mixing of different ideas that was going on. And then it sounds like along this journey, at some point, you encounter a form of Christianity that matches reality, and it gives you a way to look at things that is cohesive and really helpful. And maybe it's within that framework that some of these things resolve themselves. And so it's not so much that you're hunting for the question, that specific question, but you're just given a new way to look at life in general, and that it no longer becomes as much of an issue because the puzzle fits together. Does that
Yeah.
sound right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's definitely, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. So I cut you off. You were still exploring different forms of Christianity, but you're committed to being a Christian because of this class. You think, wow, this is
Yeah.
wonderful. I'm going to find where I can plunk myself down, and you're kind of checking out some of the more liturgical Protestant traditions like Lutheranism and Presbyterianism and the United Church, even, which have more of like a formal liturgy, so to speak, to various and lesser extents, or to greater and lesser extents. But continue. How did you get to the Orthodox Church from there?
Yeah. So this was when I was 20 years old. So I was in my third year of university at this point, and one of my close friends, Bronwyn, she started attending the Orthodox Church. I think it was actually her oldest brother who was studying. He was actually studying Catholic Catholicism, I think medieval Catholicism. He's a scholar of Thomas Aquinas, and he kind of suggested to the siblings, "Hey, you guys might want to check out Orthodoxy." And so she started going to the Orthodox Church, and I started hearing about her experiences. And this is before, I think, in recent years, there's been this more mainstream movement towards Orthodoxy, but this was kind of right before then. If I think that's safe to say. And then at the same time too, one of my English professors, he is a devout Orthodox Christian, and so I had that influence. I would go into his office to ask questions and discuss my work, and then there'd be icons in his office, and I was like, "Oh, what is this?" And so I had these more distant influences. And when I first heard about the Orthodox Church, I remember I kind of knew intuitively that I was going to go there, but I remember just feeling like, "Oh crap, this is where it's going to be, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to be a real process for me to work out." Because it is, I mean, the thing is too, is in a lot of these evangelical traditions, because you're not beholden to tradition, you can kind of make up your own things. There's more openness to interpret things as you want, or kind of be your own guide in those things. And so I was used to that, and having that freedom, and even just having the easiness of the services, where it's like you're not standing, and you're, even though I always loved the music in the Orthodox Church, and preferred that. The liturgy was long at first. It was long, and I had difficulty with that, and going to these churches where it was always serving me and my needs. And so
You had a sense that you were going to wind up there, and it's because you met your friend was going there, and her older brother had recommended that they go there. So that was kind of an influence. And so it sounds like you started going, but there was a certain degree of hesitation because it's not there's not as much theological latitude. So there is more definition around what Orthodox Christians believe in comparison to some Protestant denominations, and that may have felt constricting. And then also it sounds like the liturgy itself was pretty difficult, in the sense that, well, first of all, you're standing the entire time except for the sermon, whereas a Protestant church, or at a Catholic church too, you stand to sing, and then you sit, and then you stand and you sit. It's back and forth. So it can be kind of physically tiring to just stand the whole time. But were there other things that you were apprehensive of initially?
I think so. Yeah. So initially, when I first started attending, again, this is when there was the young adult community was almost non-existent. And I think it was just a particular situation with not only the church, but just me, and kind of where I was at with there were some personal things that I was struggling with. And so I think that made it, that was just kind of a unique situation where the theology actually made sense to me, like almost immediately. The theology, I was like, oh yeah, this is the truth about the world. And this is, and even in a weird way, it was something that in an intuitive way, I always kind of believed, even about salvation. About salvation, about the role of Mary, about communion, about confession, about all of these different things. And so when I was so when I was going to this church, it was a little bit tricky at first, just because of some of these social tensions that it was just, and it wasn't anything dramatic or anything. It was just kind of unique to that time and place in my life. And and then I think so. I went to my first Pascha service. This would have been in 2021, and it was a very unique experience. And then right after that, I went to Israel and Jordan on this pilgrimage trip with a professor from my undergrad, whom I still keep in contact with and respect very dearly. But he's not Orthodox, and he's decidedly not Orthodox. And so I would tell him about my experience with the Orthodox Church, looking into the Orthodox Church, and he would give me these counter arguments. And so that, as I was starting to kind of dig myself into Orthodoxy, some of our conversations would maybe steer me the other way. And so it kind of propelled me into a bit of further questioning and confusion. But then so the summer went by after we went to Israel and Jordan, and I wasn't really active in the Orthodox Church or the local church. But then I started attending the church again in the fall, and I had been going for about on and off for about a year and 2 months at this point, and something really, I just think it was a few things, like small things, changed. And first of all, I started to feel more welcomed into the church. I started to have more connections and friends, and then I also was talking to this professor who had led this trip to Israel and Jordan, and he gave me a bunch of material both for and in favor, and then objecting to Orthodoxy. And he said, Katrina, I respect you, and I think that you'll make a good decision, but just whatever you do, I want you to make sure that you're making an informed decision. And so I took a few months and I read through the material that he had prepared for me, and it steered me, I'd say, more towards the Orthodox Church. And then at the same time, so this is quite funny. This was one of the things that really pushed me into the church. And this is like, talk about God works in mysterious ways. But I was mostly working on my English degree at this time. This is when I was in my 4th year, and I was taking, in English, you have to take a course in critical theory, which is where you encounter, some of the feminist theory, the racist theory, or the feminist theory,
the critical race theory.
Yeah, the critical race theory. Thank you. The Marxist theory, the consumerist theory, et cetera, et cetera. And so during this time, I was taking this class, and the professor that we had for this class, she's a really great professor, and she was teaching this stuff, but she was also, able to question it and open to people disagreeing, and also open to projects and papers that maybe weren't super mainstream. And so actually for this course, I ended up writing my final paper on, and I don't know what gave me this idea, but I felt compelled to do it. I started thinking about the consumer theory and the consumerism of the evangelical church. And so I wrote this paper about consumerism, commodification in the contemporary church setting, and that was kind of the nail in the coffin, so to speak, of my affiliation with these more evangelical settings, because I felt like it's something kind of changed within me of seeing these experiences as, okay, it's not or something changed within me in terms of appreciating the Orthodox Church more. and seeing that, okay, it's not about me. This is about worshiping God. Even the priest is not facing me and talking to me and being, super cool and charming during the service. This is all about worshiping God. And I just started to see the truth in that. I started to see that as true and good. And that really sold it for me. And then I also was, obviously it was a question of tradition and church history, and then of course there was the Catholic question, and it did take me a while to decide, okay, I'm choosing to become Orthodox. I'm not going back to the Catholic Church. And I mean, that could almost be a whole other conversation in itself. But essentially, as I was looking into the history, there were certain things within the Catholic Church that, even though I always greatly admired many aspects of Catholicism, there were certain things, certain elements of the rationalism, the really rationalistic attitude, certain even just practical things, like the fact that priests couldn't be married, and then the papal dogmas, infallibility, universal jurisdiction, and those just I would look into them, and try and make it coherent to myself, but I couldn't. And so, it led me further into the Orthodox Church. So.
Okay. I was actually just about to ask that, because a lot of people that have been on the podcast so far grew up Protestant. And so then there's the classic struggles that are attendant in that path. But I was curious for yourself how you resolved the decision between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, because obviously they're both sacramental, they both have church history. Like, there's a lot that they're closer together than they are different. Like, there's so much more in common that they have than what separates them, although the differences are worth considering, obviously. So when you joined the Orthodox Church, were there certain challenges that you had to overcome initially or later down the road? And if there were, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say just kind of to add a little bit to the Catholic conversation. I think one of the things that I had to realize in making my decision between the two churches was just that with the schism, like, both sides lost something. There are scars on both sides, and that's just how it is. And so you can't, like, it's like, okay, yeah, the early church as it functioned had this the first among equals, the Roman, we had our Roman patriarch, and that losing that is no small thing. But then on the Roman side, it's like, okay, well, they lost the rest of the patriarchs and that conciliar aspect, and so that's significant as well, and there are scars on both sides. And so the question that I was looking for more, or the question that I was asking was, well, okay, which one seems to have more alignment with church history, which one I think it has changed more since and added things, and that was clearly the Catholic Church. And even thinking about the schism, I mean, I know there are different ways to go to conceive of it, and there are different arguments on each side, but it just seems pretty clear to me that if you're adding something to a creed that has been decided upon, years, centuries ago, and you're saying, okay, no, we're going to add this filioque clause, but by the way, if you don't agree with it, you're excommunicated. I mean, that seems pretty clear to me that addition is maybe not a good thing. And then just seeing some of the additions that the Catholic Church has added to doctrine, like like the papal infallibility, Immaculate Conception, even the Vatican II additions, that was something that really turned me away. The fact that the worship itself is just so drastically different from how it was in the early church, and that tradition has been removed in many respects, in many circumstances. I mean, I know there are still different orders of the Catholic worship and everything, but that was pretty clear to me once I started looking into some of those things in the way that the Catholic Church had changed. And I think that really is a result of giving this one patriarch so much authority and power, and then losing the rest of the church. So.
Right. Yeah. And I think for people that aren't familiar, like there was in ancient Christianity sort of a alliance between the different major centers of Christianity, and there was a nice balance that occurred there. And then what Katrina is talking about is that these sides drifted apart, and what is talked about is sometimes the theological differences, which are significant. Like there's this ancient creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Catholic side started to add a part to it. But also the Crusades, when they were happening, one of the significant things that really drove a wedge between the two sides is, I forget which crusade, maybe it was the Third Crusade, but they sieged and sacked Constantinople, which was the major center in the East. And that was the major thing that created a fissure between the Eastern Christians and the Western Christians, because you essentially have Western Christians going into the big center and taking it over and killing people and all that kind of stuff. So, it's human history. It's messy. But if someone was looking into the Orthodox Church and was interested in it, because we've got a number of people that are listening in that boat, what would be your advice for them, Katrina?
I would say it's really valuable to be in situations where you're going to meet people who aren't just newly converted, but have been in the faith for some time, and even cradle Orthodox. And I think that one of the things I really appreciate about the OCA parish that I've attended for a long time is that there is this mix of cradle and convert, and people who are new in the faith, people who have been in the faith for a long time, and also I think that sometimes when we're in the new Orthodox stage, there can be maybe an emphasis on the truths of the faith, and while that's important and important to look into, to be aware of, it's really I do think that there needs to be prayer, like the truth aspect. Without prayer and without working towards goodness, it's just like, okay, yeah, we know the truth, but if you don't have that goodness and that prayer life, then it's not really going to give you a full picture. And then I would also just say something that's been really helpful to me, again, is just being around people who have been raised in the faith as well, because they have a different perspective, having had it their whole lives, and there are ways in which they have a different perspective, but a very valuable perspective. And I kind of think in some ways that the cradles and the converts really, they do need each other, and so I think those are good relationships to pursue.
Yeah, that's great advice, because I know sometimes it can be that people are just raised in the church and they'll stick within their own, say, ethnic setting. Like they've been to the Greek church, they always go to the Greek church, that's all they do. And there's other people that convert to Orthodoxy and they go to the English parish, they always go to the English parish, and that's all they do. So it's nice to have that combination, because as you were saying, knowing God involves our actions and it involves our intellect. Like we're whole human people, mind, bodies, and it involves the entirety of us. Would there be any other advice that you'd have for someone looking into it, or even if you could go back in time and speak to a younger version of Katrina when she's exploring Christianity and Orthodoxy, what advice would you give to yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say just really the emphasis on prayer, and I think sometimes when we're looking into the church, it can be so exciting to see, oh my goodness, all of these beliefs line up with how I've felt about the world for a long time, or these all make so much sense. But again, where you're really going to see the change is through prayer, through actively pursuing that, through just giving yourself time. And so I would say, and even something that someone told me the day that I was chrismated, I at the time, I remember I was so disappointed, but he was like, oh, okay, well, now the easy part is finished. So yeah, now good luck with the hard part the rest of your life. I mean, he wasn't quite that blunt, but he was pretty close. And I remember I was like, that's just frustrated. Like, what are you talking about? But it really is true. It's the beginning stage is it's all going to be a process, and there's so much depth and richness in the faith, but it's something that you pursue over the course of your life. And so that's one aspect. And then I also think that if I could go back, I would probably, honestly, I would have told myself to attend some non-English speaking churches. So something that this is something when I had been Orthodox for a year, and I actually moved to New Zealand, and there were like no English speaking churches. Maybe, some with English speaking priests, yes, but not really many. And so I went to Greek churches primarily, or actually I primarily went to a Rokor church, and then sometimes a Serbian church. And those experiences were so valuable. And in some ways, I wish I had had that. I wish I had had those encounters earlier on, even maybe before I was Orthodox. Because again, when you're around people who are from these cultures or these nations that have been Orthodox for years, they have a different perspective, and there's a lot of value that added. And also a lot of, I mean, for me, and maybe I've been to many parishes kind of around the world that are what people would say more ethnic parishes, but I've honestly had really positive experiences. By and large, I felt very welcomed. I've been able to receive the sacraments. I've made many good friends in several cases, and so I think that was also good for me to see, how worship is done in another language, but just also, there are a lot of stereotypes about Orthodoxy. Oh, it's just a bunch of ethnic groups, and being able to have experiences that were contrary to that has been really helpful.
Well, that's a wonderful place to leave it for today, Katrina. So I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Max.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. If you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, there is a link in the video description that you can check out and submit your question through there. If you know someone that would benefit from watching this episode, please share it with them. And in the meantime, I hope they have a peaceful week. Take care.